Howdy, Bob here with the last of my rants, or whatever the heck you want to call them. This one's a little bit more specific than the other three, and because of that, it's also a little bit more erratic. The overall argument in this, the overall subject, is that as a writer, it is your job to do as much research as possible. Know what you're talking about. As much as possible is probably an exaggeration. You don't necessarily need to be an expert on whatever subject you're talking about, but you do need to know at least the basics, which, sadly, a lot of authors skip. Or worse, they think they know the basics, but are mistaken on one subject or another. The kind of fundamental example of this is one that actually got my attention recently in a book that I read that I loved, but that I am not going to mention by name in this because I am specifically criticizing the author's research, and it would be unfair to link his mistake to him in a rant like this. I will eventually do a book review of his book, and will make the complaint about this particular mistake, but it's going to be mixed in with all of the things that I loved about the story. So, stay tuned for that someday. Anyway, the example I'm going to use has to do with numismatics and metallurgy. Numismatics is the study of currencies. That's coins, tokens, more recently, fiat money, bills, that kind of stuff. And metallurgy, as the name suggests, is about metals. So, a substantial number of fantasy stories since the 1970s have been written with baggage from D&D, right? Because Dungeons and Dragons is so wildly popular, it creates a sort of default fantasy setting. Semi-medieval, mid-level magic, and relatively mild humanoid races. Most everything else builds off of that, but that's the foundation. And that's all fine. Unfortunately, D&D also has a tri-tier currency system that, one, is terrible, two, has become ubiquitous. The tri-tier system is, gold coins, silver coins, copper coins, with each denomination being a fixed value from the other. Either 10 coins, 10 silver to a gold, 10 copper to a silver, or 100 instead of 10. My biggest issue with this off the bat is the difference in weight between gold and silver and copper is substantial enough that gold coins are either going to be really tiny or copper coins are going to be really big in a 10-point system, unless the coins are fiat money, which is stupid for all kinds of reasons that I will get to. Well, shit, I'll do it now. So at the moment, gold is worth roughly $1,600 an ounce. Copper is balls. I know this. But I'm thinking like a few dollars a pound. You know, maybe as much as $10 a pound. That's a substantial difference. That's a lot more than 10 or even 1,000 times the cost from gold to copper, although it'd have to be 10,000 times. If you had a gold coin about the size of your thumb and a copper dinner plate, that's about the proper scale for a copper coin that is worth that is of an appropriate value for the system that they're talking about, with a 1,000 copper to a gold. If that doesn't sound ridiculous to you, your pockets are amazing, and I want them. One of the issues is that fiat currency versus commodity currency is a substantial problem right now, right? We, as a society, use fiat money. Basically, the government tells us what our dollar is worth, and we trust them because they never lie to us. Commodity currency is a currency based on a specific commodity. For example, back before the 1970s, America was on the gold standard. We had started stepping away from the gold standard in the 1930s, but it wasn't until the mid-1970s that we broke completely away from it and decided that we were not backing the dollar with gold anymore. This is kind of a silly concept for a couple of reasons, but mostly because the actual value of gold and what you can get with gold has stayed consistent even though we broke away from it. For example, back on the gold standard, a $20 suit was worth an ounce of gold because, you know, an ounce of gold was worth $20. That same suit today is worth $1,500 to $1,700, about the same as an ounce of gold. You see the same thing with foods, vehicles, property. It all stays pretty consistent with the gold standard as far as those values go. The only real gap in that is the kind of modernity aspect. What I mean by that is the most cutting-edge vehicle in 1970 was worth, you know, the same amount on the gold standard then as the most cutting-edge vehicle today in gold ounces. with a small variance for basically rounding errors. And you'll find that fairly consistently, even like historically. So yeah, this is supposed to be a rant. I have little notes of what I'm doing, and I'm not even sticking to those because, again, it's a rant, and it's one that I've gone over repeatedly. That's kind of the issue with the tri-tier currency in the gold, silver, copper, is the differences are substantial enough that the coins would have to be irrationally sized. Now, I'm going to tag on a couple of other aspects of that and then circle back, okay? So, I'll stick with numismatics for now, and then I'll do the metallurgy afterwards. Coins were originally made so that trade would be easier, right? You know, it's easy enough to say, hey, I have a goat, it's worth 3 chickens, I'll trade you my goat for your 3 chickens. But if they don't have 3 chickens, they only have 2, how do you break a goat? It's not really probable. It's difficult to do. Coins, on the other hand, were a specific weight of a precious metal that basically had a value because it was a precious metal. And strangely enough, or maybe not so much, that value was pretty consistent worldwide, regardless of culture, regardless of anything. So these ancient societies made coins that could be carried around and traded for their value in other places. And that was true of a lot of the old coins. You know, it didn't matter where they were minted. They could be made in Rome, they could be made in Alexandria, and any of the Alexandrias, because if there's one thing Alexander did poorly, it was naming things. He just named them after himself and kept going. His creativity did not extend to naming. But I mean, even you know, if the coins traveled from Rome all the way to Beijing, Beijing would have been Xi back then, but same idea, right? The gold still had a specific value that could then be turned into, you know, a certain amount of whatever cereal was in vogue in the location, whatever meat was in vogue at the location. You know, fish versus beef versus sheep, mutton, or whatever, would be about the same amount of gold wherever you went. And, you know, more precious materials were traded based on that coin. Really? Dang. So that's what the currencies were for. The 3-tier system, where did I put the lighter? There it is. The 3-tier system that we are used to, the gold, silver, copper, comes from, I don't remember what it's technically called. It's the LSD system. It's the Carolingian system. I do remember. I made a note about it, and then I forgot that I made the note. And the Carolingian system, which is a subset of the full LSD system that was originally made by Rome. The Romans had the LSD system. It was Libra, Solidus, Denarii. They had other denominations within that, but the original Roman LSD system was semi-decimal. What I mean by that is the Libra was worth something like 30 solidi, 30 pieces of silver became a gold, and I think it was like 40 or 50 solidi to a denarii, something like that. So semi-decimal. When Charlemagne came to power, hence Carolingian, because there was Charlemagne is the Carolingian emperor because of the linguistic shift in the way that the names are pronounced. And anyway, Charlemagne codified a modification of the LSD system so that 1 Libra was worth 20 solidi, and each solidus was worth 12 denarii. There were some smaller coins that were partial parts of a denarius, but for the most part, you dealt with the denarius and smaller anyway. The larger coins were pretty well ignored because they were for more valuable things than your average person was going to pay for. You know, food and everything useful were all paid in denarii. The most recognized version of it nowadays would be the old British system, which was still LSD, but it was the pound, the shilling, and the penny. And if you ever wondered why the symbol for the British pound was an L, it's because it came from Libra, from back in the Carolingian period. And the British pound stayed on the Carolingian system, 20 shillings to a pound, 12 pence to a shilling, until the early 1970s. There's a specific day, I want to say it's in December, that is called Decimal Day, a dark day indeed, when the French once more came in and took a part of British heritage away. I still sound bitter. I'm still mad about the French Revolution. It's not going to stop. And I will probably rant about that over and over again, regardless of subject. But LSD, the 2012 system, allows for a more natural division of currency than a straight decimal system can, especially when you're working with the smaller values. When you get into the larger values and everything is costing pounds and pence instead of, you know, only the expensive things possibly costing pounds. You know, the average annual wage was £2. At that point, you know, breaking your annual wages into 480 pieces, you could figure out how much you were going to be able to pay for everything pretty straightforwardly, right? As opposed to now 30, 40,000 pounds as an income, but it's effectively the same concept. They're still on a pseudo gold standard. Gold still gets you the same value, but the math is worse for you as an individual. It's easier for accountants. It's easier for the banks. It's harder for the average user. 12 and 20 breaks down much more cleanly than decimally. You can do quarters, you can do thirds, you can do fifths because of the 20s. And really it winds up being a 240 point break, which gets you basically all of the early fractions, 1, 2, 3, 5, skip 7, 11. 11's still a problem. But you get the first 4 primes, which is better than base 10, which skips 3 and 7. 7's just a horrible number to divide by in most bases. Anyway, for most people, a division of 12 is better when working with basic fractions because you can do thirds and quarters, which you can't do cleanly with a base 10. And most people naturally fall into a base 12 framing for certain things. We still talk about, a dozen eggs, half a dozen this, half a dozen that, stuff like that. There's still concepts like the baker's dozen, which that's a whole other interesting thing, which I might get to at another time, but this is supposed to be about coins, so I'm going to avoid that. Just to keep myself limited. Thank you. Sorry. So that's kind of a basic background on currency. Real basic, kind of fast and loose, but there it is. So we have the tri-tier system that most users are familiar with. You see it in a lot of fantasy, a lot of fantasy video games, and a lot of lit RPG, which tries to play out as kind of a mix between the two. But of course, gold, silver, copper aren't entirely interesting. You want to make your system unique, so you break from it and add other coins. That's fine. That's a great idea. It would work real good, except say you pick the wrong metal. How can you possibly pick the wrong metal? Well, in the case of the one book that I'm that brought this to my attention, they chose electrum as being the next step above gold. In their case, electrum was worth 100 gold, whereas and gold was worth 100 silver, and silver was worth 100 copper. You heard me say electrum, and immediately you went, what's wrong with using a made-up metal? The problem is, electrum is not a made-up metal. It's a real metal. It's a naturally occurring metal. It's an alloy of gold and silver, usually somewhere between 40 and 60% for each metal, depending on, what goes where. In gold mines and silver mines, it's not uncommon to find both metals in the mine. And when that happens, it's also not uncommon for them to be alloyed together into a kind of pseudo white metal, white gold type metal called electrum. And it's a mix of gold and silver. It actually deprecates the value of either coin, whether you're using a gold coin or a silver coin. If it has the other metal in it, there is a deprecating factor to it because there is an impurity in it. So usually when you get an electrum coin, it's worth more than a silver coin, but less than a gold coin, and is marked as something electrum, rather than as a silver that's been tainted, or a gold that's been tainted. So electrum could fall somewhere between gold and silver. No problem, right? But if electrum is worth more than gold, there is a problem, because if an electrum coin is worth 100 gold coins, and the scale of coin is not enormous, again, like an electrum coin is going to be half gold, half silver, say. The electrum coin has to be like 200 times the size of the gold coin, or there's going to be problems. Say all of the coins are the same size, just for ease of the example. And because most fantasy settings that you see basically have the coins looking like they're around the same size, around the size of like a $50 coin, or somewhere between a $50 and a quarter. It's pretty uncommon to see the small coins in fantasy, at least not talked about. But even if you were to go so far as to go from like a $50 to a dime, the difference isn't that great for scaling. So if we say that they're all about the same size, and an electrum coin is worth 100 gold, gold and silver are both fairly easily minted. So all you'd have to do is take a cast of an electrum coin, melt a gold coin and a silver coin together, and you could cast 2 electrum coins out of the gold and the silver together, taking, $1 and a cent effectively, and turning it into $200, just as a scaling example. And if you think that's not realistic, when the US was making silver quarters, there was a period of time where the silver quarter was made out of 26 cents worth of silver. And people were melting down their quarters and selling the silver ingots for the difference. That was for, pennies on the dollar. Turning it around and making it dollars on the penny, you'd have to be nuts not to go with it. So that's why knowing your metals is important. If the author had known that electrum was a real metal, there's no way he would have chosen electrum when he made that denomination. The other common one that you see is platinum. In fact, at this point, standard D&D says that a platinum coin is worth 10 gold, where a gold coin is worth 10 silver. Platinum is a little more complicated for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's another metal that we've known about since antiquity, but we didn't understand it as a pure metal. It was a flaw. We find gold coins with platinum inclusions in them. Inclusions are additions to the currency that are put there as impurities that couldn't be removed, because nobody knew how to treat platinum, how to forge it, how to work it. It could kind of be beaten with enough work, but not enough to, say, make a full coin out of the stuff, assuming you could find enough, which was difficult considering it wasn't really being hunted for in the way that gold or silver or, other precious metals or even practical metals were being hunted for. Platinum showed up occasionally in a gold mine or a silver mine as something that just had to be dealt with because it was in the way, and couldn't be worked. The first time it could actually be treated, when they actually figured out how to use it, was in the late 1700s, like 1790 something. I don't remember the exact year. I don't have it marked down because it wasn't important, or because I had it in my head at the time and right now I'm not thinking of it. But platinum couldn't have been forged until that time. It took far more advanced metallurgy than what is available in a medieval setting, you know, a Renaissance era setting. That can easily be gotten around in a magical setting, though, just by saying, oh, well, it was worked magically. But that has its own issue, in that if you're going to say that it was worked magically, that means a mage must have done it. If a mage is doing the work, they have to be paid for it. And so platinum is still going to be substantially more expensive than just 10 times whatever gold is. Because again, mage is going to get paid. Wizards aren't going to do that kind of stuff for free, especially if it's labor intensive, or if it is done in bulk. So that's two metals. One other metal that is commonly thought of as a fantasy metal, or, you know, something along those lines, is orichalcum. Orichalcum was a red gold, and we don't know what the Greeks were actually talking about when they talk about orichalcum coins. But there is a numismatic orichalcum that is still used today as this red gold. It's an alloy of, I think, gold and bronze, something like that. I'm butchering it right now, but it's another one that nobody talks about, because at this point it's kind of become, it's a term that, because we hear the term but don't hear it in the same way that we do gold, silver, bronze, copper, in common parlance today, a lot of people think that it's something that was made up. Like mithril. There's another one. Sort of. I'll get back to mithril after I'm done with orichalcum. So there is a type of gold, kind of flawed gold, called orichalcum, and it's not magical at all. It's a real thing. We don't know what the Greeks were talking about when they called it orichalcum, because the Greeks are terrible with colors. Back in the day, they said that blood was green and the sky was bronze, because effectively colors were kind of partway between an actual visible spectrum effect and the spiritual value of the color, I guess is a way of looking at it, right? Blood is green because it's the life-giving color, just like with grass, just like with, you know, whatever. The sky is bronze because it's bright and potent and shines, I guess. So, but that's orichalcum for you. It's a red gold, which could be actual red or some other color that's not really red, but has some sort of significance with the color. The numismatic gold is an alloy that we are able to make, and we have actual coins, like ancient coins, that we call orichalcum, that are effectively orichalcum because that's what we call them, but isn't necessarily the same alloy. It's like we aren't actually certain what sarsaparilla tasted like because we lost all of the recipes at one point, and then somebody remade it kind of from the memory of what their childhood was like, what they remembered the taste to be. So mithril, we're going to get, I'm going back to now. Come on. Really? You're going to fight me with this? Mithril is... Anyone who's read Tolkien, anyone who's read fantasy has probably read or at least heard of Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings, right? And mithril is his magical metal, true silver, whatever, that is hard as steel, but much lighter, somewhat flexible compared to steel. It's not as brittle. Easy, simple to craft once it's created, but the only ones who know how to create it are the elves and the dwarves. Ancient elves and, specifically the dwarves are masters of it. A little history on Tolkien himself. Tolkien was a soldier in the military in one of the two world wars. I don't remember which one. If I remember right, he was in the trenches, which would mean World War I. Because by World War II, trench warfare was no longer a thing, specifically because of aviation. Aviation had changed because a new magical metal, harder than steel, or as hard as steel, but much less rigid and incredibly lighter, suddenly had been discovered in 1909 was the discovery of this rigid metal, which could only be discovered because of the metal that the alloy was made from having suddenly been created in a way that made it financially feasible to experiment with. That metal is the most common metal on the planet, but is naturally bound to clays. This metal is, of course, if the hints haven't been obvious yet, aluminum. Mithril is aluminum, specifically duralumin, an alloy of aluminum. Aluminum's been known about for a very long time, but was only able to really be tested, or not tested, but separated from the silica that it naturally bonds with in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Late 18th century, early 19th century. So after the U.S. was founded, basically. And there was a very complex chemical process that was used to pull the aluminum from the silica slurry, from the clay. Most people are familiar with aluminum. It's a silvery metal, somewhat soft, workable, and efficiently, it's a good metal to work with. But it's not especially strong, not compared to steel or anything like that. And with all of those chemical processes, it was incredibly expensive. In fact, when gold was $20 to the ounce, this early aluminum was worth somewhere around $1,800 or $1,900 for an ounce. To the point, it was so valuable that when the Washington Monument was built, and when it was built, it was the tallest building in the world, the capstone on the very top, that triangular peak, is made of that expensive aluminum. So, of course, shortly after that, the Washington Monument was finished and the capstone was put on, someone found a process in the late 1800s, somewhere around 1890, to remove aluminum from the silica clay cheaply and efficiently, basically running an electrical current through the slurry mixed with a light acid, like a lemon juice type acid. Cheap, efficient, and relatively fast. It took the $1,900 aluminum and made it worth about 20 cents for the same amount. Suddenly it went from being 1,000 times the price of gold to 1,000th the price of gold. And then in 1909, a German discovered a way to alloy aluminum to make duralumin, which is the metal used to make most aerodyne vehicles at the time. World War I, all of those planes had cloth wings. World War II, they had discovered duralumin and had started making fully metal airplanes that could fly because they were made out of this light, silvery metal. Tolkien, a historian, a linguist, a soldier, was very interested in aviation. It was one of those things that we don't really think about because of everything we know about him. Most of what your average person knows is he wrote The Lord of the Rings, and The Lord of the Rings basically founded modern fantasy. So mithril, this magical metal that we all love and praise and all of that, is actually just airplane metal. But in an ancient scenario, it wouldn't have a name like aluminum. Because why would there even be a word like alum, which is what aluminum comes from? White. Yeah, anyway. So that's mithril. Now, why does this matter? Why does doing your research, knowing what you're talking about, matter in this sort of scenario? It calls back to what I was saying in a previous rant about verisimilitude. Anyone who actually knows what, for example, electrum is will immediately see the problem in making an electrum coin that is worth more than a gold coin. And that will pull them out of the story, especially when it's something that's easy to point out, like electrum. A little bit of research would have fix that problem. So for the author in question, what are his options now, right? He can choose either to change the name of that coin in the, second edition of his book and make it so that it's not electrum, it's some other metal. Or he can double down and say that electrum is a name for some other for some other metal that is not the same metal that it is in the real world. Double down and stick to electrum being that currency, coin, value. Either one works because at the end of the day, it's his world and he can make it fit. But if he does choose to stick to electrum, he has to be consistent with it, which means he can't ever really talk about a gold-silver alloy. Unless he makes up another name for that, which gets complicated because suddenly you're making up words in place of words that mean the same thing because the word is already being used for something else. It's like making a duck into a type of horse and then trying to figure out what to call that bird, the duck. But it can be done, especially with unusual words or words that are real and true, but outside of common parlance. A good example of that is in the Dresden Files. Jim Butcher uses the term thaumaturgy for a specific type of magic. In the real world, in real world magic, in real world descriptions of magic, thaumaturgy basically means miracle working. It could cover anything from sorcerers performing feats of magic in Roman stories or medieval stories, or actual miracle working like Jesus walking on water, or feeding the 5,000, or any of the miracles that any of the saints performed. Those are all technically thaumaturgy, but not in the Dresden world. In the Dresden world, he follows, he uses it to describe the Crowley concept of as above, so below. And because he sticks to using that term specifically for that concept, things like voodoo dolls or or other effects of that sort are, in the Dresden world, thaumaturgy. That's done. Because Butcher sticks to that term, he's correct in using it, as this other author using electrum technically incorrectly could double down and stick to electrum in use. If it was me, I would change it, specifically making up a new metal or finding some non-fantasy metal or some non-real metal to replace it. But that's just me. If the author decided to double down and stick to electrum, that would work just as well, so long as he stuck to it. And that kind of has to do with the way that jargon is built in the first place, right? Even in error, as long as you stay consistent, verisimilitude isn't necessarily going to be lost. It's more difficult with a word that is common, but because of the way that jargon works, you can still make it fit. For example, in carpentry and geometry, they both have a specific use for the word square, right? In geometry, a square is a four-sided polyhedron with 4 equal corners and 4 equal sides. In carpentry, a square is a triangle with 1 right angle and measurements on all 3 sides, right? It's a tool versus a specific shape. But so long as you are working within the context of carpentry, someone who is talking about a square versus something that is square, which is another thing, some words get layered and layered and layered into having multiple definitions. And that's kind of one of the frustrations of jargon. But as long as you are consistent in the terminology, you're fine. But you can work this more easily by using the right word in the first place, knowing how a word is actually used in the real world before you try and use it for something else. There's another important reason for this that's less about jargon and more about litigation. And that's, copyright risk, right? There are certain words or terms that will get you in trouble because they are copyrighted or patented or whatever, intellectual property, blah, blah, blah. For example, going back to Dungeons and Dragons, some of the monsters that they bring up are public use, right? Elves are something that anyone can use because they've been around forever. Dwarves, same idea. Halflings, same idea for the most part. Gnomes are weird because there are so many different kinds of them. Orcs are another interesting one because of the history of the term. There are the Tolkien-esque orcs, which are, perverted elves. There are the Dungeons and Dragons orcs that are a unique race that has no relation to elves. There are the original orcs, which are from L. Frank Baum's Wizard of Oz world, which are these weird griffin-like creatures with propellers for tails. Very different from what most people think of as orcs, but that's the oldest version of the word that I've been able to find. At the same time, Dungeons and Dragons also has certain races that are copyrighted. For example, the Illithid, the Mind Flayer, these tentacle-headed monsters are copyrighted. They're considered intellectual property of Wizards of the Coast, and if you try and use them outside of their mythos, outside of their publishing houses, you can get hit with a cease and desist. You can be, seriously punished. So you have to be careful with certain terms like that. As an author, it's your prerogative to attempt these terms, but if you're not careful, you can get seriously, you can get slapped with a cease and desist, you can get slapped with other things. They can lock your book down so that it can't be published. And that would be a nightmare. So long as you're too small to matter, Wizards will ignore you. It's kind of like Disney in that way, right? Disney will ignore you until something that you're doing is obviously a reflection of something that's theirs, and then they will start trying to sue you. And sometimes those lawsuits will be for things that don't even really make sense. Like, the Snow White dress is like red and blue and yellow, right? Tricolor, fairly simple design. It's roughed shoulders, a long skirt, no pleats, that kind of thing. If you make a dress and try and sell it that looks too much like that, they can come down on you. They have in the past come down on individuals making such dresses for sale. And even when they didn't win, because something they're trying to claim as theirs is too generic for taking, for having a copyright or intellectual property claim to, they can bury you in litigation until you can't afford to keep going. And that's a win for them even if they lose, because you've had to shut down and move on to something else. So always be careful with that sort of thing. As an author, it's your responsibility to know these things, to work these things out. Yeah, I think that's really about it. On the subject of jargon, I could keep going. I could go for hours. But as an example of how to work jargon out for yourself, I'm going to use something from my own writing, just as kind of a proof of concept, maybe. I don't know. The story that I've already released on Kindle Vella is called Eternal. It's called Life is Eternal, and it works on the Eternal system. It's a lit RPG. Characters are playing a game based on a system called the Eternal system. It's oh my god, what is it called? Experiential training. Emotional training experience for the reification of native artificial life, something like that. Basically, the idea is to create an emotional environment that helps substantiate artificial life forms in computers. Most people would think of them as like AI, right? Artificial intelligences, blah, blah, blah. But I don't want to use AI, artificial intelligence, to mean a non-biological thinking life form. I'm going to stick with SI, synthetic intelligence, versus the biological intelligence that we know as humans. It's a small difference, but it should be a unique, not unique, but a distinct difference. Artificial intelligence is intelligence that might seem real, but is still artificial. Synthetic intelligence is real intelligence from a non-biological entity. And it's sort of the aspect that there's a challenge in proving intelligence in a species, in an entity, because um, we don't really understand how to do it ourselves. Um, but in many ways, it comes down to whether a thing is intelligent in that it is able to perform specific rote tasks based on input, or if it is actually able to create its own independent thoughts. And it's really, really, really hard to prove. Like they've got the Turing tests um, from Alan Turing back, um, in the way back days when computers were starting to come out, and Turing said, this test should show intelligence. But even if we reach a point where this complexity is realized in computers, it still won't prove that they are truly intelligent in the way that humans are, especially since not all humans can pass a Turing test, because it's fairly complicated. It's not just about intellect, it's about emotional response. There's a degree of irrationality to it, I guess is a good way of putting it. It's extremely complicated. And one of the big arguments over whether a synthetic life form can truly be an intelligence in the way that humans are has to do with the idea of, the religious believing that humans specifically have souls. And there's an argument, a belief that a machine, no matter how complex, could not have a soul. And if man was to create a creature, a synthetic creature, a computer capable of having a soul, that would be acting against God. Turing actually had his own rebuttal to this, and I actually wrote it down because I got sick of trying to get it correct when he said it well enough in the first place. In attempting to construct such machines, we should not be irreverently usurping his power of creating souls any more than we are in the procreation of children. Rather, we are, in either case, instruments of his will, providing mansions for the souls that he creates. Meaning, in Turing's mind, having children or creating a synthetic life form that is capable of holding a soul isn't taking, God's will, God's power into our own hands. We are simply creating a thing that God can choose to put a soul into as he creates them. How that actually lines up with specific religious dogma is anyone's guess. It's not my intention here to try and proselytize any specific type of religion or belief. But I do agree with Turing. Whether or not you believe in souls, if souls conceptually are a necessity for true intelligence, then an artificial life form is just as likely, a synthetic life form is just as likely to be capable of having a soul as a child that's been given birth. And for the same reasons. God in his ultimate power can choose who and or what is worthy of a soul. That's a complete other tangent, and I had meant to be talking about coins and metals, and I'm on to souls. So that's not what I was trying to argue. What time is... I just broke the hour mark. I am going to call this rant done because shit. I I've wandered off the path anyway. So yeah. Anyway, if you liked this, you hated it, either way, I hope you got something out of it. I hope you learned something. I hope it affected your opinion in one way or another, whether you changed your opinion on me, on something that you read, or, neither, and just decided that I have no idea what I'm talking about on this subject. Yeah, that should be my last, the last of my guided rants. Not that this was especially well guided, as I did not actually follow the notes that I left very well. But I got everything on the list, so that's half a victory. Yeah. Authors, do your research. You are good enough. Your story is worth the effort. And if it's not, why are you trying to share it? Bob out.